The rain hadn't stopped for 3 nights. It wasn't a storm. No thunder, no lightning. Just a steady, cold drizzle that turned gutters into little black rivers and smeared the neon glow of Brooklyn into long, bleeding colors on the street. Anthony Corallo sat in the back seat of his favorite Jaguar, a smooth steel gray 67 Mark II. He never drove it, never even touched the wheel. He didn't have to. That's what Jimmy the Zip was for. Silent, clean-shaven, always 5 minutes early and never asked questions. The car moved slow through Little Italy like a ghost, the engine purring beneath the sound of the rain tapping the hood. Tony Ducks wasn't flashy, not like Gotti, not like those Hollywood clowns. His suits were plain but fit like skin. No gold chains, just silence, timing, and fear. You never saw him coming, and if you did, it was already too late. He earned the nickname Ducks because of his gift, or maybe it was a curse, for slipping past indictments. Federal, state, city, it didn't matter. They came, they tried, and he'd walk. Always. Like a duck through water, the charges just slid off him. 20 arrests, 0 convictions. The papers loved it, the feds hated it, and the 5 families, they trusted him. But this wasn't just a story about a mobster with a lucky streak. This was about the quiet death of an empire, and the man who saw it coming too late. The Jaguar pulled up to an unmarked warehouse on the edge of Red Hook. Not flashy. Just enough distance from the city to be invisible, but close enough for a quick exit. Tony adjusted his cufflinks, checked the Rolex he never looked at unless he wanted you to notice it, then nodded to Jimmy. Inside the warehouse, 3 men were already waiting. Carmine Jr., Persico from the Colombos, Benny Squints from the Lucchese's, and Paul Castellanos' guy, some smug suit who never said a word unless he was quoting Paul's orders. They were the tail end of what used to be called the Commission, the shadow government of the Mafia. But by '79, things were cracking. Wiretaps were getting better. Guys were flipping. RICO laws had teeth, and the feds had stopped playing games. This wasn't the golden age anymore. This was the end game, whether they admitted it or not. Tony lit a cigarette and looked at them one by one, like a tired father checking on his sons before a storm. "You hear about Cleveland?" he said quietly. Persico nodded. They took down Johnny Scalish's crew, 30 indictments, state and federal. Tony exhaled slowly. "They're not coming for our money anymore. They're coming for the whole structure, like termites." Benny Squints cleared his throat. "Then maybe it's time we go quiet, real quiet. Pull back the unions, keep the noise down." "No," Tony said. Not loud, not angry, just final. "We don't pull back. We dig deeper. We bury the roots so deep they can't reach." But even as he said it, something flickered in his chest. Not fear. Tony hadn't felt fear since the first time he saw a man get shot in the face at 12 years old. No, this was something else. A pressure, like the walls were shifting, like time was moving faster than it used to. He was 65 now, and the streets didn't look like they used to. Outside, the rain picked up. Inside, Tony crushed out his cigarette and stood. "The next time they come," he said, looking around the room, "they won't be aiming for the foot soldiers. They'll be looking for the heads." Then he turned and walked back into the rain, the Jaguar door already opening for him. He got in, silent, soaked in shadows, and disappeared into the Brooklyn night. Before he ever sat in the backseat of a Jaguar, Anthony Corallo walked barefoot through puddles of blood and spit in the gutters of East Harlem. Born in 1913 to Sicilian immigrants, Tony came into a world already poisoned by poverty, violence, and silence. The kind of silence that didn't mean peace, but fear. The kind of silence that could get you killed or make you rich. His father was a cobbler, quiet and broken. His mother, the kind of woman who didn't blink when the landlord sent 2 men to collect rent with hammers. They paid late once, never again. The first time Tony saw death, he was 8. A boy, no older than 16, got stabbed outside the butcher's shop over a stolen pack of cigarettes. The butcher never stopped chopping meat. Nobody screamed. Nobody ran. Tony just stood there, hands in his pockets, watching the blood circle the curb like it belonged there. And maybe it did. He didn't cry. He didn't even blink. He just watched, observed, That's who he was, always watching. By the time he was 15, he wasn't in school anymore. He was running packages between bars and gambling houses, quiet deliveries, no questions, no smiles. The older guys liked him because he wasn't loud, didn't brag, didn't steal a slice off the top. He listened, always listened. He understood something most boys his age didn't. Power didn't come from being seen. It came from being remembered, but only by the right people. One of those people was Johnny Dio, a labor racketeer with the kind of money that didn't get printed, it got made. Dio noticed the quiet kid. He liked how Tony didn't ask for anything. He offered work and Tony delivered. No complaints, no excuses, just results. That's what got you in. Not bloodline, not bravado, but the ability to get things done without leaving a trace. Tony climbed fast, but not loud, never loud. He learned early that the cops weren't the real danger. The real danger was ambition without strategy. He saw too many guys want to be kings before they learned how to be pawns. Guys who showed off their money, their girls, their Cadillacs, all dead before 30, buried in silk suits and plastic smiles. Tony didn't want a crown. He wanted control, not just of money, but of systems, labor, construction, sanitation, the arteries of the city. If you controlled the flow, you never had to shoot anyone. You just closed the valves and let them choke. He joined the Galliano family, which would later become the Lucchese family. But Tony didn't walk in demanding respect. He earned it by turning the labor unions into his chessboard. The garment workers' union, the trucking industry, construction sites from the Bronx to Jersey, every deal, every contract, every accident on site went through his desk eventually. He never carried a gun, never needed one. His weapon was leverage. You owed him, he remembered. You crossed him, he waited, you disappeared. Nobody asked. It was in the 1950s that he made his first real fortune, not through drugs, not through extortion, but through Teamsters and concrete. He used his ties with Dio to lock down the unions, then began squeezing suppliers for kickbacks. Nothing moved unless Tony allowed it. He didn't ask for permission, he gave it. By the time he was in his 40s, he was living like a ghost with a bank account, a townhouse in Forest Hills, a mistress in Hell's Kitchen, 2 Jaguars, and not a single phone line registered in his name. He didn't exist, not to the IRS, not to the feds, not to the press, only to those who knew his number. But the thing about ghosts is, they still cast shadows, and the FBI was starting to notice. It was 1960 when Tony got picked up in a sweep tied to Dio's labor racket. A few guys flipped, others vanished. Tony sat in a cold room for 8 hours. They tried to rattle him, called him a fraud, a parasite, a coward hiding behind his lawyers. He just smiled, not smug, patient. Like a teacher waiting for a child to finish his tantrum. "Am I being charged with anything?" he asked. "No," the agent said, grinding his teeth. "Then I'll be leaving." And just like that, Tony Ducks lived up to his name, sliding past indictments like water through a sieve. It happened again, and again, and again. 20 arrests, 0 convictions. By now, the street feared him, not because he was violent, but because he didn't need to be. That's what made him terrifying. A man who could crush you without lifting a finger. But there was another side to Tony, one that the newspapers never bothered with, a side only a few saw, and even fewer lived to talk about. He loved silence, but not the silence of empty rooms. He liked the silence of precision, of German-engineered doors closing softly, of leather seats that creaked just enough to feel real, of Italian shoes tapping against marble without echo. His Jaguars were never about status. They were about control. Every inch of those machines was built to obey. They didn't argue. They didn't betray. They did exactly what you asked when you asked it. Tony respected that. In a world full of chaos, Tony clung to order. But order couldn't last forever, especially not in a world that was changing fast. The late 60s brought drugs into the game. Heroin, cocaine, fast money, reckless men. Younger guys didn't care about tradition or strategy. They wanted power now. They didn't understand patience. And worse, They didn't respect silence. Tony hated the drug trade, not for moral reasons, he wasn't that naive, but because drugs made men sloppy, and sloppiness got you caught. Got you flipped, got you dead. He kept the Lucchese family out of the worst of it, made sure the real power stayed in labor, sanitation, construction. But the other families, they dove in head first. And soon, the streets weren't just bloody, they were stupid. Guys were getting pinched for showing off in clubs, tapping their own phones, bragging to girlfriends who worked for the FBI. It was chaos, and Tony hated chaos. In 1973, Carmine Tramunti, the then boss of the Lucchese family, got hit with heroin charges, heavy ones. Tony had kept his hands clean, and when Carmine went down, the family needed a new boss, someone smart, patient, invisible. There was only one name on everyone's lips: Tony Ducks. He didn't celebrate, didn't throw a party, didn't buy a new Jaguar. He just nodded once, lit a cigarette, and went back to work. As if being boss was just another job that needed doing. But power is a strange thing. When you don't want it, it follows you. When you do, it eats you. By the mid-70s, Tony was the most respected mob boss in New York, even if the public didn't know his name. The commission meetings ran through him. He was the bridge between old blood and new money. He kept the families in check. No wars, no loud bodies, just business. But the world outside wasn't quiet anymore. Technology was changing. The feds were learning. And most dangerous of all, a new law had been signed into existence. One that would change everything. The RICO Act. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. Before RICO, they had to catch you doing the crime. Now, all they had to do was prove you were part of the system. You didn't need to pull the trigger. You just had to exist within the structure that did. Tony read the papers. He knew what was coming. And for the first time in decades, he felt it. Not fear, not regret, but friction. Like something grinding against his mind that wouldn't go away. He was growing older. His world was growing louder. And the silence he once commanded was now a liability. So he did what he always did. He adapted. He stopped using phones, no meetings in restaurants, no recorded words, no documents. Every message was passed in person, every order spoken in code, every decision handled by someone else, 3 levels below him. He became a myth inside his own kingdom, a ghost among ghosts. But ghosts can be caught too, if you follow their footsteps long enough. By 1983, the FBI wasn't guessing anymore. They were listening. Not to Tony directly, but to his driver, Sal Avellino. The man who had been beside Tony for years, quiet, loyal, but careless. The Jaguar had been bugged. The same car Tony trusted like a friend had become a weapon used against him. And Tony, the master of silence, had finally spoken, just enough. In those recordings, Tony talked about unions, deals, names. He never said the word murder, never admitted anything outright. But Rico didn't need confessions, just connection. The tapes would later become the backbone of the commission trial, the most devastating legal hit to the Mafia since Prohibition. And Tony? He didn't run, didn't cry, didn't beg. He sat in court, calm as ever, listening to his own voice played back through tinny speakers. He didn't flinch, not once. The man who had built an empire out of silence was now being destroyed by it. The courtroom smelled like dust and stale ambition. It was the fall of 1985, and the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York looked more like a stage than a place for justice. The air was thick with perfume, cigar smoke on clothes, cologne splashed over nervous skin, and the invisible scent of blood money. On one side, the Mafia's highest seat of power. On the other, the U.S. government, wearing clean suits and smug grins, ready to gut the thing they feared and admired in equal measure. At the center of it all sat Anthony "Tony Ducks" Corallo, flanked by other giants like Carmine Jr. Persico, Anthony Salerno, and Lucchese lieutenants, too careful to look anywhere but down. Tony didn't twitch. He didn't cough. He didn't even check his watch. He sat in silence, the same way he always did. like a man waiting for a train he already knew was coming. But outside that courtroom, the noise was deafening. The commission trial, as the press called it, was the biggest legal attack on La Cosa Nostra since Al Capone got tricked by tax evasion. This wasn't about hitting soldiers, this was about dismantling the entire structure, top down. And the architects of this masterpiece weren't gangsters, they were prosecutors. The key to it all? A Jaguar and a microphone. Back in the early 80s, Salvatore Avellino, Tony's trusted chauffeur and Lucchese capo, had been too comfortable, too confident. He figured a car was safe. Tony did too. After all, it wasn't an office, it wasn't a wire room, and there were no phones, just leather seats, closed doors, and the quiet hum of tires over New York streets. But the feds were evolving. They got Sal talking. He dropped names, orders, slips of information that to a street guy sounded like nothing. But to federal agents armed with RICO, it was gold. Then they found a way to bug the car itself, something straight out of a Cold War novel. Tiny mics hidden deep inside the dash, voice-activated, always listening. And Tony? He'd talk. Not often, not recklessly, but enough. They caught him referencing union plays, contract manipulation, the votes given to each family boss during commission decisions. He never said murder. He didn't have to. When you're running an empire, a shrug is a sentence. In court, the tapes were played one after the other. Poor quality, fuzzy, but clear enough. Tony's voice filled the courtroom, and the illusion shattered. He wasn't a ghost anymore. He was real, tangible, human, the very thing he spent his life avoiding. The jury leaned in, the press scribbled notes. The agents, who'd spent years chasing shadows, finally heard the Godfather speak with their own ears. And the bosses? They listened in silence, just like Tony taught them. Some shook their heads, others stared into the table. But Tony? He didn't react, not even when they played back his own words. "We don't want nobody unionizing garbage unless it's us. You give the other families 20%, but we keep the rights to the docks. That's the deal. If a guy don't listen, we take away the contract. Let him starve." It was like watching a king watch his own execution on film, knowing every move was his, but unable to rewind a single frame. The prosecutor, Rudolph Giuliani, made it personal. And he stood in front of the jury with a photo of each defendant, all 9 of them, lined up like baseball cards for organized crime. He didn't scream, didn't spit. He spoke with calm certainty, like a man who already knew the ending and was just savoring the reveal. "This," Giuliani said, pointing at Tony's picture, "is not a boss in the shadows. This is not folklore. This is a man who sits at the head of a criminal empire that controls unions, contracts, and labor in New York City." He paused. "And we didn't need an informant to say it. We have his voice." Tony watched without blinking. If Giuliani thought he could break him with theater, he didn't understand the old world. Tony came from a place where your mother slapped you before your enemies could, where pain was currency and silence was God. He wasn't afraid of prison. He was afraid of irrelevance. Outside the courthouse, things weren't any better. The Lucchese family was in disarray. Lieutenants were scrambling. Captains didn't know who to answer to. The street guys were scared. Nobody wanted to visit Tony or call in favors, because every phone line felt like it was buzzing. Even his old allies started distancing themselves. The Colombos were imploding under Persico's reckless temper. The Gambinos were caught between Paul Castellano's cold logic and John Gotti's thirst for war. And the Genovese, they were watching, always watching, but not lifting a finger. Tony had always believed in order. He thought the commission kept things civil, balanced. But order only exists if everyone plays by the same rules. And with drugs, greed, and young blood flooding the game, nobody was following anything anymore. He saw it clearly now. The Mafia wasn't dying because of the feds. It was dying because it had become noisy, and noise was fatal. In his cell at Metropolitan Correctional Center, Tony kept to himself. He didn't complain, didn't ask for special favors. He refused to speak to anyone who wasn't his lawyer or his priest. He read old books. He stared at the wall. He wrote nothing down. Sometimes when the guards passed by, they swore they heard him whispering in Italian. Not prayers, not curses, just stories, like a man talking to someone already dead. One night, his cellmate, a Dominican kid in for heroin trafficking, asked him something. "You really the boss?" Tony looked at him, took a moment, then said quietly, "I used to be." That was all. The trial dragged on for months. Each tape, each testimony, each nod to racketeering, extortion, bribery. It wasn't the violent stuff that got them. It was the paper trail of silence. Tony had outsmarted 1,000 agents in his time, but he never outsmarted technology. He didn't believe in it, didn't adapt. That was his mistake. He trusted the car. He trusted the seat he loved. He trusted the old ways, and the old ways betrayed him. In November 1986, the jury came back, guilty, 100 years for racketeering, conspiracy, extortion, operating a criminal enterprise, no parole, no options, no bargaining. When the sentence was read, Tony didn't flinch. He simply stood, buttoned his coat, and said, "Let's go then." In the transfer van to USP Springfield, a federal medical center turned high-security fortress, he sat alone in the back, hands cuffed, wrists aching. He looked out the window. Gray sky. No trees. Just long stretches of concrete and broken fences. No more Jaguars. No more quiet rides. Just bars. Steel. And the end of the silence he built his life around. But in the corners of the underworld, in the whispers of old union halls, in the back rooms of construction sites, in the rusted-out garages of Queens, they still said his name. Not with fear, not with loyalty, with a kind of respect that only comes once a generation. Because Tony Ducks Corallo wasn't a gangster who wanted to be famous. He was a gangster who wanted to outlive the noise. He didn't. But in a world full of loud men with empty power, Tony Ducks was the last man who understood that sometimes a whisper can be louder than a gunshot. They brought him in through the back, USP Springfield, a sterile fortress wrapped in cold Missouri wind. Wasn't like Rikers or MCC. This place was where the government tucked away dying legends, mob bosses, cartel kings, old spies, and ghosts with arthritis. You didn't end up here unless you were sick, old, or just too famous to risk putting in general population. Tony Ducks Corallo was all three. They didn't chain him hard. No one shoved him or barked orders. The guards knew who he was, not because of fear, but respect. That old school kind of recognition that comes from understanding you're walking beside history, even if it's the kind written in blood and bribes. He was 74 now, and prison didn't scare him. Not because he was tough, but because he'd already buried every part of himself that could be broken. The cell was small. One narrow bed, a metal desk bolted to the wall, a tiny window too high to see out of, and a toilet that hummed like a bad radio. He didn't complain. He didn't speak. He unpacked slowly, methodically, one sweater, one book, one small plastic bag of approved toiletries. There was no welcome, no threats, just silence. That suited him. Tony sat on the edge of the bed and closed his eyes. Not to sleep, he never really slept anymore, but to listen. He always said the most honest places in the world were hospital corridors, funeral homes, and prison cells. Not because people told the truth, but because the air was too thin to lie in. And this place? This was where truth came to rot. In the days that followed, Tony barely moved. He didn't walk the yard, didn't ask for mail, refused visitors. Even his lawyer had to fight to get 5 minutes, but he wasn't depressed, he wasn't broken, he was calculating. This was the first time in his entire life where he didn't have to be responsible for a single person. No street guys calling for orders, no union bosses asking for favors, no capos whispering about percentages, no one to please, no one to kill, just time. And time, for the first time, was all he had left. But outside those prison walls, the world was changing fast, and not in his favor. The Mafia was fracturing. The 5 families were now 4.5. And even that was generous. The Colombos were at war with themselves, Junior Persico still pulling strings from prison while upstarts carved bodies into pavement. The Gambinos, John Gotti was running them like a Hollywood cowboy, giving interviews, shaking hands, smiling for the cameras like a man begging to get caught. Tony had watched the Gotti tapes with the kind of grim disapproval a father reserves for his dumbest child. "The minute they know your name," he once said, "you're already dead. Might take a year, might take 10, but the clock's ticking." Gotti's clock was loud. Tony's had always been silent. In prison, Tony started receiving letters. Some were from family, some from young street guys trying to impress him, some from historians, journalists, students chasing the ghost of Cosa Nostra. He read them, every single one, but never replied. Why? Because replying meant admitting that he had something to say. And Tony knew better than anyone. The second you start talking, the government starts listening. Still, the words stuck with him. One letter from a young Sicilian named Marco asked, was it worth it? The money, the silence, the time? Or did it all just slip through your fingers when the doors closed? Tony stared at that letter for hours, not because he had an answer, but because he wasn't sure he did. He began thinking about his father, the cobbler, quiet, tired. A man who worked himself into the ground for pennies while the neighborhood kids starved and stole. Tony had once sworn to himself, sitting on a stoop with shoes too small and a stomach half empty, that he'd never live like that he'd die before he lived powerless. And he didn't. But now, he sat in a cell smaller than his childhood bedroom with arthritis in both knees and a watch that no longer ticked. So he wondered, did power buy peace, or just a better coffin? The only time he really moved was during Catholic service. Once a week, Sundays, he'd sit in the back, never took communion, never spoke. Just sat there, hands folded, eyes half closed as the priest read from scripture. The younger inmates didn't know what to make of him. Some thought he was ex-military. Others thought he was a serial killer. One rumor said he used to be a senator who'd snapped and killed a guy with his bare hands. The truth, they didn't care. Because Tony never spoke unless someone earned it, and none of them had. It wasn't until an old associate got transferred into Springfield that Tony's silence broke. Frankie Balducci, a former Lucchese button man who'd done 10 years in Allenwood, was now pushing 60 and had developed lung cancer. The doctor said he had 6 months. They put him in the same unit as Tony, probably by design. One night in the common room, Tony was reading The Prince by Machiavelli. Again. Frankie sat across from him with a cough that wouldn't quit. "Still reading that garbage?" Frankie said with a smile. Tony didn't look up. "It's not garbage, it's instructions." Frankie laughed, a deep, wet cough of a laugh. "You follow the instructions. I followed the money. Guess we both ended up here anyway." Tony finally looked at him. "Difference is, I knew I would." That night they talked for hours. Not about the past, not about who killed who or what deals they'd pulled. They talked about regret. Frankie admitted to losing his daughter, not to death, but to silence. "She married a dentist," he said. "I missed the wedding. Thought it was smart. Keep her clean. Now she won't even write me. Says she has a son. Says he doesn't know my name. All that time, and I thought I was protecting her. I was just disappearing." Tony nodded. Not out of pity, but because he understood exactly what Frankie meant. When you choose the shadows, you don't just lose the spotlight. You lose everything that grows in the light. Family, laughter, softness. Tony had a son, too. At least, he thought he did. One time, one woman, a girl from Brooklyn who never asked him for a thing. He used to send her envelopes once a year. No return address, no name, just money. But even that had stopped in the 80s. He didn't know if she was alive. Didn't know if the boy, if it even was a boy, had his last name or someone else's. He'd never asked. Because asking meant caring, and caring makes you visible. Tony grew weaker. The arthritis was now in his spine. He walked like glass, stiff, slow, like each step was a negotiation with pain. His Jaguar? Long gone. His suits? Dust in a storage unit. His empire? Divided, crumbling, run by men who didn't know how to build, only burn. And yet, every once in a while, a guard would call out his name with a certain pause, like they couldn't believe it was really him. Like they were standing next to a piece of legend. He was no longer feared, but he was still respected. And in the world Tony came from, that was the last currency left. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the gray prison walls, Tony sat outside on a bench near the exercise yard. The sky was bleeding gold and orange. The air smelled of metal and dying summer grass. A young inmate, couldn't have been more than 22, walked by, paused, then turned around. "You really Tony Ducks?" he asked. Tony looked at him, took a breath, then nodded once. The kid grinned. "Man, you don't look like the stories." Tony stared at him, then said, "Good. If you look like the stories, you didn't survive them." The prison yard had gone quiet. It wasn't the stillness of peace. Tony knew that feeling. This was something else, something thinner, more artificial. Like silence put on display for effect. Out there in the real world, the mob was still breathing, but it wasn't living. It was twitching, like a dying animal that didn't know it was already gone. Tony sat on the bench near the edge of the yard, wrapped in an old gray coat the prison nurse had given him, one that smelled faintly of bleach and pine cleaner. The Missouri air was colder now, even though summer had only just slipped out the door. His bones ached like hell, but that wasn't new. What hurt more was the noise, not in prison, but out there. Because out there on the streets he once controlled were kids playing gangster with gold chains and video cameras, talking too much, dying too fast. He watched it unfold from the inside. Newspapers, news clippings, whispers between guards, occasional notes from loyal contacts in the bureau, and every single update made one thing clear. The mob had changed, and not for the better. It started with John Gotti. Tony never liked him, not because Gotti was violent, violence had its place, but because Gotti was loud, too loud. "Every camera he smiles for," Tony once said to his lawyer, "is a bullet with his name on it." And he was right. Gotti turned the Gambinos into a circus, flashy suits, clubs, public swagger. Like he thought being a mob boss was about winning popularity contests instead of running an organization that lived and died in the shadows. He strutted. He posed. He let his crew run wild. What Tony built with silence, Gotti torched with applause. And the others? They followed. It wasn't just the Gambinos, the new captains, the young blood, the third-generation tough guys. They all thought being a made man meant you were invincible, untouchable, a walking god. They forgot the golden rule. Power is borrowed. And when you forget to pay it back, it gets taken, one bone at a time. In the 90s, indictments started stacking up like poker chips. Guys were flipping faster than ever. No omerta, no shame. Just deals and reduced sentences. Tony read their names. Sammy the Bull Gravano, Gotti's underboss, testified. Brought the whole house down. 20 men dead and the man walked. Tony couldn't believe it. Back in his day, flipping was worse than death. If a guy talked, you didn't just kill him. You erased him. From photos, from stories, from memory. You made his family disappear too, just so no one dared to speak his name again. Now? Rats had book deals, TV interviews, merchandise. One guy even opened a restaurant. The Lucchese family, Tony's family, was no better. After Tony went away, Vittorio Vic Amuso took over, and Vic? He was muscle, no strategy, no class, just paranoia and bullets. He didn't know how to talk to unions, didn't care about infrastructure. He wanted total control, but didn't know how to hold it. So he started killing his own men. Suspected traitors, suspected disloyalty, suspected thoughts. And when the smoke cleared, half the family was either dead in hiding or testifying. Tony knew then, from behind bars, cold hands gripping the railing of his bunk, that the game he helped perfect had become a suicide pact for idiots. One afternoon in 1993, a young inmate named Ramos sat down near him in the common room. He'd been watching Tony for weeks, curious but respectful. Not loud, not flashy, just waiting for the right moment. "I used to work the phones in Brooklyn," Ramos said. "Ran errands, small stuff. My cousin knew a guy who knew Gotti." Tony didn't reply. He just looked out the window. Ramos leaned in. "I think the Mafia's dead, Mr. Corallo. All that stuff you guys did, it's gone. The street belongs to the gangs now. Bloods, Crips, MS-13. They don't wait for rules. They shoot first." Tony turned his head, slow like an old machine. "You think we waited?" he said, voice dry as paper. "You think there were rules?" Ramos shrugged. "You guys didn't shoot kids. You didn't brag. You had order. Codes." Tony leaned forward, eyes hard. "We didn't have codes. We had discipline. You want to call that morality, fine. But don't pretend it made us saints." Silence stretched between them. Then Tony said something that stuck with Ramos for the rest of his life. "We weren't better than them. We were just quieter when we bled." Back in the cell, Tony thought about his legacy. Not the plaques, not the trial, but the idea of him. What would be left? A footnote in 1,000 true crime books, a few grainy photographs, a voice on a wire, a name that no kid under 30 recognized anymore. Maybe that was justice. Maybe that was peace. But it didn't feel like either. He started to notice his hands trembled more. His joints stiffened. His breathing turned shallow at night. He asked the prison nurse for fewer pills, not more, because he didn't want clarity. He wanted fog. At least in the fog, his past didn't scream as loud, but even the fog couldn't block out the truth. The men who inherited his empire weren't builders. They were consumers. They devoured what he built and left nothing but debt, bodies, and headlines. And now, they were serving life, just like him. Or they were dead. One night in 1996, he got a visit, unannounced, no warning. The guards escorted in a young man, late 20s, olive skin, brown eyes, nervous but not afraid. Dressed too clean to be a street guy, too polite to be a cop. The man sat down. "I think you knew my mother," he said, and something in Tony's spine shifted. The name came next, a girl from Brooklyn, a name he hadn't heard since the 50s. "My name's Daniel," the kid said. I think I'm your son." Tony didn't speak. He didn't blink. He just stared. Daniel cleared his throat. "I work in construction. I've got a baby daughter now. Your granddaughter." Still, silence. Daniel placed a photo on the table. A baby girl, smiling. Pink onesie, soft eyes. Tony looked down at it for a long time, then pushed it back. "Why now?" he asked. Daniel's eyes softened. "Because I wanted to know if there was anything good in me." Tony looked up, and for the first time in decades, his voice cracked. "There is," he said, "because you're not me." That night, Tony didn't sleep. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the corner of the wall like it held a secret map to somewhere better. The next morning, he requested a Bible. Not to pray, not for forgiveness, but to feel the weight of something heavier than his regrets. The New World would never understand Anthony Corallo. It didn't speak his language, a language of eye contact and silence, of cigarette smoke and folded paper, of cold logic and quieter sins. The new mob, it screamed too much, died too fast, and forgot the one rule that mattered most. Power means nothing if you can't walk away from it with your mouth shut. Tony Ducks never begged, never made a deal, never gave them what they wanted. And maybe, just maybe, that made him the last real boss. By the spring of 1998, Tony Ducks Corallo was no longer the feared boss of the Lucchese family. He wasn't even a whisper in most corners of the street. He was just inmate of Mbaro Quamon 49 199 4, a man in his mid-80s with swollen knuckles, blurred vision, and a world of crime turning to dust in his memory. The prison staff had changed. The guards who once lowered their voices around him were gone, replaced by younger men who didn't know or care who he was. The older inmates had either died, been transferred, or forgotten how to speak. The ones who remained called him Old Man Corallo, as if he were just another gray fossil with a sad cough and a long stare. But Tony didn't mind being forgotten. He welcomed it in a way. Because once you're forgotten, you're finally free. His days were slower now. He woke before the lights, shuffled to the sink to splash cold water on his face, stared into the cracked mirror, as if expecting someone else to look back. His reflection didn't match the man who once stood in $5,000 suits, driving decisions that reshaped entire industries. That man was gone. What remained was someone else, someone quieter, colder, stripped of ego but still bound by memory. In early April, Tony received a letter, handwritten, no return address, no fancy paper. It simply read, "The last of them flipped. Vincent turned on Vic. The family's over. It's all gone. Thought you'd want to know." No signature. Just that. Tony read it twice, then tore it in half. He didn't throw it away. He left the 2 torn pieces folded inside his Bible, not next to scripture, but inside the blank cover. That was his way. No drama, no tears, just acknowledgement. He already knew the truth anyway. The Lucchese family, his family, was now a shell of itself. After he went down, the organization fell into chaos. Vic Amuzzo and Gaspipe Casso took the reins and ran the ship straight into the rocks. Casso was ruthless, erratic, and loud. Everything Tony had spent his life avoiding. They ran wild with murder contracts, corrupt cops, drug rings. For a while, the money poured in faster than ever. But fast money doesn't stay, and loud money gets caught. By the mid-90s, they were both arrested. Casso flipped, something unthinkable in Tony's era. Vic got life. Dozens of loyal soldiers turned into witnesses overnight. The Lucchese name, once synonymous with quiet control, was now a punchline in FBI offices and courthouse hallways. Tony wasn't surprised. He was disappointed, but not surprised. Back in his cell, the world felt thinner. He would sit and listen, not to the voices of inmates, but to the wind as it slipped through cracked windows, to the faint clinking of keys, to the shifting weight of the building settling. It was all noise, but it was real. Not the kind of noise the world outside made now, not sirens and social media and wiretapped bragging, but the ancient kind. The kind that reminded you the earth still turned, even after you stopped being useful. Tony had made peace with irrelevance. What he couldn't accept was waste. He thought often about how it all could have been different. Not for him. He never believed in second chances. But for the thing he'd tried to build, an empire of order in a world of chaos. He remembered a conversation from 1972, back room of a seafood joint in Red Hook. Dim lights, thick smoke. A young capo, ambitious too fast for his age, had asked him, "Don't you ever want more? Mansions, headlines, real power?" Tony sipped his wine, then answered, "Real power is knowing you can take it and choosing not to." The kid didn't understand back then. But Tony meant it. He could have expanded, could have gone into drugs, could have dipped into foreign arms, trafficking, even politics. He didn't. Because power without discipline is just noise. And Tony hated noise. One of the nurses in the infirmary, a middle-aged woman named Carla, took a liking to him. She said he reminded her of her grandfather, silent, steady, stubborn. She brought him books, cleaned his sheets, sometimes snuck him extra packets of sugar for his coffee. "Why don't you ever talk to the other old-timers?" she asked one day. Tony shrugged. "They're talking to remember. I'm quiet to forget." She chuckled. "Well, that's poetic." He smiled faintly. That was as close to affection as he got these days. Every Sunday, he still went to Mass, not for God, not even for forgiveness, but for the rhythm of it, the slow, predictable pace, the Latin, the incense, the quiet room where no one asked questions and no one expected answers. Sometimes he'd sit through it and think about the Jaguar, the way the seat hugged him, the way the engine purred through the rain, how safe it used to feel inside that car. A moving throne, a leather coffin with wheels. That car heard more secrets than any priest, and it had betrayed him without saying a word. In June of 1999, he suffered a small stroke. Not major, just enough to slow his right hand and slur his speech for a few days. The doctors warned him he'd need more help, that this could be the beginning of the end. Tony nodded once. That was it. He didn't cry, didn't panic, just made sure the Bible was kept close. In the margin of one of the Psalms, he scribbled a single line. I outlived the empire, not the silence. Later that year, Carla found him in the courtyard, dozing on a bench under a tree. His eyes fluttered as she sat beside him. You okay, old man? She asked. He opened one eye and nodded. Just listening. To what? Tony smiled weakly. The world when it forgets you existed. The last letter he ever received was from his son, Daniel, the one who'd visited a few years back. It came with a photo of his granddaughter now walking, holding a stuffed giraffe, her curly hair tied up with a red ribbon. Daniel had written, I don't want to know your crimes. I just want her to know you had a name, that you were real, that she came from something. Tony read it twice, then stared at the photo for a long time. He didn't cry. He couldn't. That part of him was long gone, but he felt something heavy crack open inside. Not pain, but something stranger. A kind of peace he didn't know how to hold. He folded the photo and placed it between the pages of The Prince, right where the chapter on fortune and power began. His final days were quiet. No drama. No sudden death. No dramatic last words. He slipped in and out of sleep. He watched dust fall through sunlight. He dreamed in black and white, streets, rain, leather seats, and voices he hadn't heard in 40 years. And on a Monday morning in August 2000, he didn't wake up. No heart attack, no choking, just silence. Carla found him with his hand resting on the Bible, eyes closed, breathing still. She said he looked peaceful, but the guards said nothing. Just called it in, cleaned the bed and moved on. No fanfare, no obituaries in major papers, just a footnote. Anthony Corallo, dead at 87, buried with no ceremony. Survived by a name no one wanted to speak. But in the cracks of the city, in the old cafes, under the tongues of dying men with memories too long to trust, his name still mattered. Because in a world that had turned the mob into cartoons, Tony Ducks was the last man who knew when not to speak. Before the wiretaps, before the Jaguars, before courtrooms and codes and concrete, there was just Anthony, not Tony Ducks, not a boss, not even a man. Just a boy with calloused hands and sharp eyes, growing up in East Harlem with nothing but empty pockets and ears wide open. The neighborhood smelled of roasted chestnuts, cheap cologne, and coal smoke in the winter. You didn't need a watch in those days. You measured time by the sound of street vendors yelling about oranges or fish, by the hum of radios behind open windows, by the fists slamming against doors over unpaid debts. Tony's father had a cobbler shop on 116th, a quiet, hunched man who spoke in Sicilian whispers and smelled of glue and leather. He didn't smile. He didn't drink. He just worked, stitched, and coughed, all day, every day, until his knuckles turned into knots and his back became a question mark. Tony learned something from watching him. Hard work didn't buy freedom. It bought survival. And survival was just another name for slow death. He didn't want that. So at 14, Tony stopped going to school and started delivering packages for a man named Vito Granetti, a numbers guy with silver teeth and a pinky ring that could knock out an eye. Everyone knew Vito wasn't just numbers. He ran protection. He handled debts. He made people disappear, softly, surgically, like they were never supposed to be there in the first place. Tony didn't ask what was in the packages. He didn't look at the envelopes. He just moved. Fast, silent. He was good at it. Vito noticed. So did others. By 16, Tony had graduated to carrying messages. No more packages. Now it was whispers passed from car windows to backroom doors, often sealed with a nod, sometimes with a glance. He learned the game fast. The words didn't matter. The way they were delivered did. In this world, tone was everything. You didn't shout orders, you breathed them. The first time Tony saw a man die, he was 17. It wasn't planned. It wasn't even supposed to be him in the room. But Vito had sent him to drop off an envelope to a warehouse in the Bronx. No questions, in and out. But when Tony pushed the door open, he walked straight into a betrayal in progress. 2 men were tied to chairs. One was bleeding from the mouth, his shirt soaked through. The other was pale, shaking, trying to speak, but too scared to finish a sentence. Across the room stood Frankie Baresi, one of Vito's enforcers. A brute of a man with a twisted nose and the eyes of someone who'd seen too much to care anymore. Tony froze. Frankie looked up, cigarette hanging from his lip. "You weren't supposed to be here yet," he said. Tony didn't move, didn't run, didn't even breathe loud. Frankie stared at him. "Close the door." Tony did. Then he stood there, arms loose at his sides, as if waiting for instructions. Frankie pulled out a gun. No ceremony, no yelling, no movie lines, just one shot. The pale man slumped in his chair. The room didn't even echo. The sound just absorbed, like the building had been waiting for it. Frankie looked at Tony. "You didn't see anything," he said. Tony nodded. Frankie flicked the cigarette onto the floor and crushed it with his heel. "Good. Now hand me the envelope." Tony stepped forward, handed it over, and walked out without turning his head again. That night, Tony didn't sleep, not because of guilt, but because he understood something essential. The man who screamed before dying, he was forgotten the moment the blood stopped dripping, but Tony, who said nothing, who did nothing, who simply witnessed in silence, he was remembered. That silence bought him trust. That silence became his currency. Vito called him the next day. "You handled yourself," he said. "A lot of kids would have screamed, or cried, or run." Tony didn't reply. "You know," Vito added, "you keep that mouth shut, you could go far." Tony understood exactly what that meant. From then on, he was pulled in deeper, not by force, not even by ambition, but by gravity, the natural pull of a system that rewards those who can move like smoke and vanish like guilt in a confessional. Tony became a ghost in plain sight. He wasn't the loudest, wasn't the scariest, but somehow everyone knew his name, and the ones who didn't, they learned fast. By 19, Tony had been involved in 2 hits, not as the shooter, but as the logistics man. He planned the routes, tracked the victims' routines, mapped out escape paths, made sure the streetlight was busted at just the right intersection, and each time when it was done, he walked away with clean shoes and a full memory. He never forgot anything. Not who pulled the trigger, not who ordered it. Not who didn't flinch and who blinked too fast. He filed it all away. Because one day, it might matter. He wasn't made yet. That would come later. But the Lucchese crew already had their eyes on him. Quiet, loyal, efficient. And when Vito eventually got picked up on tax charges and faded into legal limbo, Tony filled the vacuum, not with force, but with familiarity. People trusted him already. He didn't have to demand control. He already had it. He started managing bookies, then small-time loan sharking, then local union deals. Nothing big, nothing flashy. But everything was organized, efficient, precise. That was his gift. Not blood, not charisma, structure. Where most guys wanted to be kings, Tony just wanted to build a machine that worked. He didn't care whose name was on the envelope, so long as the numbers added up. But success breeds envy, and envy breeds noise. A kid named Rocco Munzi, 3 years older, loud, ambitious, impulsive, started stepping on Tony's toes, tried to steal bookies, offered higher cuts, laughed too loud at jokes about Tony's father being a shoe fixer in the slums. Tony said nothing. He didn't respond, didn't retaliate, not right away. Instead, he let Rocco run his mouth for 2 months. Let him dig his own grave with arrogance. Then, one night at a union meetup in a downtown bar, Tony walked over to Rocco, leaned in and whispered, "You're not going to make it through the year, not because I said so, but because you already wrote your ending and everyone's just waiting to read it." Rocco blinked, tried to laugh it off, but 3 weeks later, he was gone. Disappeared. No noise, no body, no witnesses. And Tony? Tony didn't say a word. That moment, that shift, was when the old men started calling him Ducks, not because he ducked charges, not yet, but because he moved like one in the rain, calm, low to the ground, eyes always watching, and nothing ever stuck to him. The name would evolve, the myth would grow, but it started in that bar, that whisper, that look in Tony's eye that told the world. You don't need to scream to kill someone. Sometimes, all you need is to wait. It was winter, 1935. New York wore its cold like a second skin. Brick buildings huddled together for warmth, chimneys pumping gray clouds into the sky like factory smoke, and the streets soaked with black slush that turned leather shoes into wet regrets by the end of the block. Anthony Corallo was 22. He was still lean then, still quick, still wearing second-hand coats and gloves with the fingers cut out. But his eyes had already changed. They'd hardened like river stones smoothed over by too many secrets. He didn't laugh much, didn't ask questions, didn't flinch when doors slammed or gunshots popped 3 blocks over. He had earned his place, not through muscle, not through noise, but through discipline. The kind of discipline that made older men pause when he walked into a room. He was young, but he knew when to keep his mouth shut, and in their world, that was rarer than loyalty. By that winter, Tony was no longer just a messenger or errand boy. He was running books, overseeing loan collections, smoothing out union disputes with a handshake and an unspoken warning. He never carried a gun. He didn't have to. He carried memory. And that was more dangerous than any bullet. He knew who owed who had skeletons, who cried when things got tight, and who tried to act brave when their hands were trembling under the table. So when Salvatore Tramonti, a respected Lucchese capo, asked to see him in person, Tony knew what it meant. It was time. They met at a bakery in Arthur Avenue, the kind of old-school place that always smelled like flour, boiling sugar, and heat. The back room was dark, lit only by a flickering ceiling bulb and the glow of a cigarette burning in a nearby ashtray. Tramonti was already there, short, square-shouldered, wearing a fedora like it was part of his skull. Beside him sat 2 men, Dominic Cangiano, another Lucchese soldier, and a man Tony didn't know, older, with pale blue eyes and a nose that looked like it had been broken in 3 wars. "Sit down," Tramonti said without looking up. Tony sat. "You know why you're here?" Tony nodded. "Yes." "Good," Tramonti said. "Then I don't have to waste my breath." The ceremony was simple, quiet. No pomp, no drama, no Hollywood bullshit, just tradition, old blood, old words, and a cut that meant everything. Tramonti placed a folded napkin on the table, pulled out a needle, pricked Tony's index finger, then handed him a small card, a holy picture of Saint Sebastian. "Hold it," he said. Tony took it in his fingertips. Tramonti lit a match. The card flared to life, the heat burning against the pads of Tony's fingers. As the smoke curled up, Tramonti spoke. "If you betray this family, may your soul burn like this." Tony didn't blink. He didn't flinch. He let the flame die naturally, only dropping the card when there was nothing left to burn. The others nodded. That was it. He was made. When they walked him out, the cold bit harder. The streets hadn't changed. The city hadn't noticed, but he had. He was no longer Anthony, the quiet kid who ran packages. He was Tony Corallo, a made man in one of New York's 5 families. He walked slower that night, not out of fear, but out of understanding. Because now, every step he took left footprints that mattered. Becoming a made man wasn't like getting a promotion. It was more like getting married, but to the life. From that moment forward, he wasn't his own. He belonged to the family, to Cosa Nostra, to the code. It meant no more petty work. It meant access to bigger operations. It meant protection, the kind you couldn't buy. But it also meant responsibility. Real responsibility. When someone went missing, he had to know why. When money disappeared, he had to know who touched it. When a guy got out of line, he didn't just report it, he fixed it. And fixing it didn't always mean talking. His first job as a made man came 2 weeks later. A union delegate in Queens, Frankie Morello, had been skimming off job site contracts, sending a little too much toward another crew, thinking no one would notice. Tony didn't go in with a bat. He didn't send muscle. He invited Frankie to dinner, a nice little joint in Brooklyn. White tablecloths, heavy plates, real wine. They talked about weather, baseball, business. Then Tony leaned in and said, "You're not in trouble, Frankie, but you're standing too close to it." Frankie tried to laugh. Tony didn't. The silence said everything. The next morning, Frankie returned all the money and made sure the contracts went back through the correct channels. No blood, no bodies, just a conversation. And the family took notice. Tony wasn't just feared, he was trusted. And trust in their world was better than fear. You could scare a guy into doing what you wanted, but you couldn't scare him into thinking you were the future. Trust did that. Through the late 30s and into the early 40s, Tony built a reputation for being impossibly effective. He cleaned up messes, he restructured old rackets, he fixed broken money lines without drawing heat, and all without breaking a sweat or raising his voice. He wasn't just a soldier anymore, he was an architect. And architects don't build for today, they build for the next 50 years. One afternoon in 1943, during a sit-down between crews, a young wise guy started talking too much, boasting about deals, bragging about enforcement work, laughing too hard, too long. Tony leaned over to his capo and whispered, "That one dies young." The capo raised an eyebrow. Tony nodded. Too loud. Doesn't know he's already painting a target on himself. Less than a year later, the kid caught two in the chest behind a meat market in the Bronx. Nobody even blinked. Tony didn't gloat. He didn't say, "I told you so." He just moved on, because prediction wasn't ego. It was survival. By the end of the decade, Tony was no longer just in the family. He was of it. He had investments in construction, waste management, labor unions, trucking, and city contracts. He never signed papers, never made phone calls, never walked into the spotlight, but everything ran through him. If you wanted a permit, you had to call someone who had to call Tony. If you wanted a job site to stay open, Tony's name had to be whispered, just once, to make sure it stayed that way. His name never made headlines. That was the plan. He didn't become a boss by accident, he became one by default. Because when everyone else got loud, Tony stayed silent. When others started chasing cars, clothes, and club nights, Tony chased systems. And when the bosses started dying, shot, flipped, or buried, there was always one man left in the room, smoking calmly, watching the pieces fall exactly where he expected them to. That's how you survive in a world built on betrayal. You don't shout, you don't pose, you listen. And when the time is right, you become the silence that kills everything else. By 1950, New York was rebuilding itself. The war was over. America was drunk on victory and construction. Skyscrapers clawed at the sky. Bridges groaned under new traffic. The city pulsed with men in suits, steel beams swinging over their heads like godless metronomes. Everyone was moving. Everyone wanted more. And Anthony Corallo? He was already 5 moves ahead. While other wise guys were muscling bookies and chasing nightclub broads, Tony was plotting his quiet takeover of the city's veins. The places where real power flowed, labor unions, sanitation routes, trucking hubs, and construction sites. He wasn't interested in headlines. He didn't care about being called a boss. That kind of glory got you noticed, and being noticed got you killed. What Tony wanted was infrastructure. Because if you control the routes, the garbage, the steel, the contracts, you don't need a gun. The city needs you more than it fears you. His first major play came with the Garment Center. Midtown Manhattan, a maze of tailors, sweatshops, and fabric distributors, buzzing with movement and thick with old world money trying to pretend it was American. Every rack of suits, every bundle of silk, every bundle shipped out of those warehouses had to move. And moving meant trucks. Trucks meant Teamsters. And the Teamsters in those days were hungry. The union was bloated, underpaid, and badly organized. A fat pig with no shepherd. Perfect for someone like Tony, who knew how to walk into chaos and find the pressure points. He didn't walk in with threats. No guns, no ultimatums. He walked in with structure. He found union leaders drowning in debt, crooked bosses behind on kickbacks, and low-level drivers trying to double-dip on contracts. Tony offered to clean it all up. For a cut, of course. He fixed their books. Cleared out bad apples. Negotiated better rates with trucking companies that were, conveniently, owned by guys who owed Tony favors. The union went from a bleeding animal to a lean machine. But it was his machine now, and nobody saw it coming. That was Tony's genius. He never owned anything directly. No signatures, no addresses in his name, no invoices with his fingerprints. He moved through shell companies, cutouts, and trusted buffers, guys who were too scared to cross him but too clean to connect to him. If the FBI followed a money trail, they ended up in a dead-end LLC with a janitor listed as the CEO. If they followed a phone call, they landed on a payphone outside a candy store in Queens. Tony wasn't there. He never was. But everything still moved because of him. By the early 1950s, the Lucchese family was taking notice, especially Tommy Lucchese himself. Lucchese wasn't like the other bosses. He didn't care about club girls or body counts. He liked order, profit, strategy. He saw in Tony something he didn't see in most men, a future that didn't depend on bullets. Under Lucchese's blessing, Tony expanded. Next came the construction unions. It started small, just a few crews working downtown. But soon Tony had his hands in cement deliveries, crane rentals, plumbing permits, electrical inspections, every screw that held a building upright, and he played it slow. One foreman at a time, one city inspector at a time. He didn't bribe them. He helped them, found their weaknesses, fixed their debts, protected their sons, sent their daughters to college. In return, just a signature here, a favor there. A slight delay on this site, a quiet approval on that one. It wasn't extortion, it was management. When skyscrapers went up in Midtown, they used Tony's concrete. When housing projects broke ground in the Bronx, the trucks were Tony's. When the mayor stood at a podium cutting a ribbon, the steel under his feet had been laid by a crew that answered to Tony, whether they knew it or not. The beauty of it all? He never stepped on stage. He let others wear the crown while he controlled the kingdom from behind the curtain. His name rarely came up in wiretaps. He didn't yell on phones. He didn't argue in diners. He moved like a shadow, quiet, unshakable, necessary. By the time the 60s rolled around, Tony was a millionaire several times over, and almost nobody outside the five families knew who he was. He wasn't flashy. He didn't buy a mansion. He didn't throw parties. He bought 2 Jaguars, custom-tuned and silent as ghosts, and a modest home in Forest Hills, tucked away on a quiet street where he could disappear when he needed to. His wife knew better than to ask questions. His neighbors thought he was some kind of contractor or lawyer. He never corrected them. But behind the quiet facade, Tony was everywhere. If a guy didn't pay his debts, Tony handled it. If a politician needed votes, Tony delivered the unions. If a rival crew wanted to move in on a job site, concrete wouldn't arrive for weeks, and rats would magically show up on the property overnight. He didn't need to fire a single shot. Because when you own the systems, all you need to do is stop the flow. His influence stretched beyond construction. He was tied into waste management, using trucking unions to redirect contracts. He whispered into the ears of city councilmen, helping pass zoning laws that favored his allies. He was even connected to judges, not through threats, but through favors built up over decades. A favor here, a fix there. One broken law for a saved marriage. One vote secured for an unspoken promise. That's how he operated. Not with force, with memory. In 1965, Tony pulled off one of his most legendary moves, the Civic Center contract coup. The city was preparing to build a new municipal building downtown. Dozens of contractors were vying for the project. Political donors, big-time developers, and 1 or 2 front companies tied to rival crews. Tony didn't push his own guy. He let the bidding war play out, then quietly sabotaged the top 3 competitors. One got hit with an unexpected audit. One had their union workers walk off the job due to weather concerns. The last? His building permit disappeared mysteriously in City Hall, then reappeared a month later, unsigned and outdated. By the time the smoke cleared, a small firm, one with no red flags, no enemies, and no reputation, won the contract. Nobody noticed that Tony's cousin-in-law sat on the board. The Civic Center was built on time, under budget, and the city hailed it as a triumph of clean government work. Tony made $600,000 on the back end. No fingerprints, no heat, no headlines. By the late 1960s, people in the underworld referred to Tony with a kind of reverence usually reserved for dead saints or retired generals. The quiet one. Mr. Clean. Tony the Ghost. But the most common name, the one that stuck, was the one the feds hated. Tony Ducks, because no matter how hard they tried, nothing stuck. Arrests came, charges came, he walked every time. Not because he had great lawyers, though he did, but because his hands were always 3 layers away from the dirt. FBI agents called him a logistical genius. They said his mind was like a flowchart that rerouted every connection through buffers, clean fronts, and dead ends. But they couldn't touch him. Not yet. Because as long as Tony never said a word out of place, he didn't exist, not in a way they could prove. He was building an empire made of silence, brick by brick, favor by favor, union by union. And it was working. But even Tony, as smart as he was, couldn't predict what came next. Technology, greed. And a generation of young guns who didn't respect the rules he helped write. New York in the 1970s wasn't the same city Tony Corallo had mastered. The skyline still stretched upward like ambition. The streets still buzzed with traffic and tension, and the unions still flexed their muscles at City Hall. But something else had crept in, something noisier, faster, and more reckless. The code was breaking. The silence was fading. Tony could feel it before he could prove it. It started in small ways. A low-level soldier showing up to a sit-down wearing a gold chain too thick. A young driver mouthing off in front of an old capo. Guys flashing cash in nightclubs, thinking it made them look powerful when all it really did was get the FBI's attention. Tony hated Flash. Flash meant ego, and ego meant exposure. He'd spent decades building a criminal empire that worked in shadows, tight, precise, faceless. But now, the new blood wanted their names in neon. They wanted to be celebrities instead of criminals. And that was poison. Heroin was the first real crack in the foundation. Tony had always avoided the drug game, not because he had morals, morality had no place in the business, but drugs made men careless, and careless men brought heat. He remembered the old days, when gambling and labor rackets were the bread and butter. You controlled the money, the flow, the tempo. And if the police showed up, you either had a judge in your pocket or a guy who'd fall on the sword for a price. But narcotics changed the stakes. The money came faster, the men came younger, the sentences came longer. Suddenly, guys who used to do 6 months for loan sharking were facing 25 years to life. And when those years started stacking up, they started talking. Tony sat in a small meeting room in Forest Hills in the fall of '73, sipping espresso and listening to 3 captains argue over whether to allow heroin back into certain corners of the Lucchese territory. Vic says it's clean, one of them said, leaning forward. He's got guys bringing it in straight from Sicily. No middlemen, high yield, low risk. Tony didn't blink. And when one of them gets pinched, he asked. They won't. Tony raised an eyebrow. You sure? You willing to bet your mother on that? The room fell silent. Tony leaned back, set his cup down gently, and said, when the feds come for you, they don't knock. They kick the door off the hinges. You think they care who's clean when they're dragging your kids out of bed? He stood up and adjusted his coat. You want fast money? Join a lottery. This family's built for long games. We don't run. We don't scream. And we sure as hell don't sell poison to the neighborhoods that protect us. He walked out, and for a while, that was enough to stop it. But only for a while. The mid-'70s brought a wave of new players. Loud, greedy, sloppy. John Gotti was coming up in the Gambinos. A walking contradiction to everything Tony believed in. flashy clothes, press attention, and a hunger for fame that didn't belong in their world. Tony didn't hate Gotti. He feared what Gotti represented, because Gotti wasn't alone. The new generation, men raised not in the streets but in stories about the streets, wanted the glory without the groundwork. They didn't want to build empires. They wanted to sit on the thrones without earning them. And worse, the public loved them. The same people who used to fear the Mafia were now watching movies about it, buying posters of Brando and Pacino, pretending they understood the life because they'd seen it on a screen. The streets were being romanticized, and in the process, the real men were being replaced by caricatures. Tony doubled down on secrecy. He stopped using phones entirely, stopped attending big meetings. Every order was passed face-to-face, with vetted buffers delivering messages like sacred relics. His Jaguar became his mobile office, a steel bubble of silence. But the FBI was getting smarter too. They had RICO now, and wiretaps more sensitive than ever. It wasn't enough to catch a man with a gun in his hand. All they needed to prove was that he was part of a criminal enterprise, and if you so much as discussed business in the wrong car or the wrong room, you were done. Tony started noticing strange things. His driver, Sal Avellino, had begun to talk more than usual. Not too much, but enough. A comment here, a mention there. Guys they used to trust suddenly growing distant, others getting nervous when his name came up. Then came the whispers, that someone in the crew might be cooperating, that Sal might have been sloppy or worse, compromised. Tony didn't react publicly. He never did. But inside, he felt it. The concrete was cracking, not just in his crew, but across the entire commission. The commission, the Mafia's secret government, its balancing force, the table where the five families met to keep peace, was changing. Where once men like Tommy Lucchese, Carlo Gambino, and Vincent Gigante sat with calm calculation, now it was hotheads, opportunists, and street soldiers with delusions of grandeur. Deals weren't being honored, sit-downs were being skipped, murders were being committed without approval, messy, public, stupid, and the feds? They were watching it all, recording it all, stitching together a tapestry of stupidity that would eventually become the commission case. Tony met privately with Paul Castellano in 1980 in the back of a steakhouse closed for renovations. They didn't eat, they didn't joke, they just sat in the dark, away from ears. Castellano leaned forward, thick fingers laced together. "They're gonna come for us soon, Tony. Not just soldiers, us, the bosses." Tony nodded slowly. "They already are." Paul stared at him. "You ready for it?" Tony didn't answer for a long time. Then, "I've been ready since I was 12. But it's not us I'm worried about. It's the idiots behind us who'll get us all killed." He wasn't wrong. Because even as Tony tightened his grip, the empire he'd built was starting to rot from within. Greed, laziness, young blood with no respect for silence. Guys were wearing wires for immunity deals, selling out 10 years of loyalty for 20 months of freedom and a ticket to Florida. Tony watched from the shadows as everything he'd constructed, every route, every handshake, every buffer, was slowly being unraveled by men who didn't understand the game. It wasn't about cops or politicians anymore. It was about entropy. The machine was too big, too loud, and it was coming apart. In 1983, when Tony was arrested as part of a wiretap sweep, he didn't panic. He knew the game. He knew the charges. He figured he'd duck it again. He always had. But this time, it was different. The tapes weren't from a room or a phone. They were from his car, the Jaguar, bugged from bumper to brake pedal. His sanctuary, his throne, turned into a confession booth for federal agents. And he knew then, they've caught up. The room wasn't as loud as you'd expect. When the most powerful bosses of the American Mafia were brought together in one place, in handcuffs under fluorescent lights, wearing tailored suits and blank stares, you'd think there would be tension in the air, so thick you'd choke on it. But it wasn't like that. It was worse. The silence was suffocating, not the respectful kind, not reverence or fear. It was the silence of men who knew the war was already lost. and were now just waiting to be sentenced for the crime of surviving too long in a world that didn't want them anymore. Tony Ducks Corallo sat still, back straight, cuffed hands resting on the table in front of him. His expression never changed, not during the swearing in, not when the prosecutor began his opening statement, not when they rolled out tapes from his own Jaguar, tapes of his own voice. He sat like a man listening to someone else's funeral. And in a way, he was. The commission trial began in February 1985, with Rudy Giuliani standing at the front of the courtroom, wearing his usual smug grin and the certainty of a man who thought he was about to kill history. He didn't see mobsters across the aisle. He saw trophies, scalps, chiseled names that would look great in headlines and better in political speeches. Giuliani was sharp, no doubt. He'd been patient, methodical. The RICO laws were his hammer, and he swung them with glee. 9 men sat in the defendant's box, not foot soldiers, not bagmen, bosses. Each of them charged with running the Mafia as a criminal enterprise, using murder, extortion, racketeering, and labor corruption as business tools. Tony, as boss of the Lucchese family, was at the heart of it. The prosecution didn't rely on blood or gunpowder. They relied on conversation. Because Tony had done the one thing he'd sworn he never would. He had spoken, even if only a little, even if only in his car, to his driver about his business. The Jaguar had been bugged, tiny microphones surgically implanted, capturing every grunt, every cough, every stray sentence. And Tony had let his guard down, just enough. One tape, played on the second day of trial, captured a conversation between Tony and his driver, Sal Avellino. Tony: "Tell him we control the garment center, not the Columbos. If they keep pushing in, we shut the trucks down." Sal: "Got it. What about the union vote?" Tony: "If Jimmy wants to stay breathing, he'll vote our way. If not, he's replaceable." The jury sat frozen. The press scribbled like mad. Giuliani looked like he was about to orgasm right there at the table. Tony? He didn't even flinch. But the damage was done. See, Tony wasn't caught because he committed the crime himself. He was caught because he confirmed what everyone already suspected, that the Mafia was a government unto itself. The commission wasn't just some mythical round table. It existed. And he sat at the top of it. The trial dragged on for months. Lawyers tried every trick in the book, arguing that the tapes were inadmissible, that the charges were too broad, that the FBI had overstepped. But the feds had built the perfect storm. They had tapes, they had flipped soldiers, they had blueprints of the entire machine, from the sweatshop worker paying protection all the way to the bosses signing off on hits. One by one, the puzzle pieces fell into place. Tony watched it all calmly. He didn't curse, didn't shout, didn't beg, because Tony knew something no one else in the room understood. You don't beat a machine by yelling at it, you outlast it, or you die quietly. Outside the courthouse, New York was changing again. The news was filled with footage of him and the others walking in and out of court in chains. Not the kind of footage that made you look like a king, but the kind that turned you into a relic. The city didn't fear them anymore. It pitied them. And for Tony, that was the worst fate of all. During a lunch recess in April, one of the guards asked him something. "Do you miss it?" Tony looked up. "The life." Tony paused, then said, "I miss the silence." As the weeks passed, more tapes were played. More betrayals were revealed. Sammy the Bull, Henry Hill, Tommy Agro, names that would become infamous in their own right, showed up in side cases, dropping names, trading testimony for time. The world Tony built, based on secrecy, tradition, and quiet power, was being sold to the highest bidder for book deals and immunity papers. And he couldn't stop it. One moment stuck out. Midway through the trial, Giuliani held up a list, a commission contact sheet, scribbled names, code names, meeting notes, all decoded. He read them one by one. When he reached Tony D, he paused. "This," he said, holding it up like a trophy, "is not folklore. This is not fiction. This is organized crime as a corporation, and Anthony Corallo is its CEO." There was silence. Tony didn't blink, didn't even look up. Inside, he knew it was over. Not just the case, but the era. The Mafia wasn't going to die because of gunfire. It was going to die because everyone had stopped whispering. On November 19th, 1986, the verdict came down. Guilty. All of them. Tony Ducks Corallo, 100 years in federal prison. No parole, no bargaining, no escape. The courtroom didn't cheer. It didn't need to. The world outside already had. When the guards cuffed him and led him away, Tony didn't say a word. He didn't look back at the jury, didn't glance at Giuliani. He just walked, slow and proud, like a man stepping into his own tombstone. Later, in his cell, one of the younger inmates asked him, "What's it feel like? Losing everything?" Tony stared at the wall, then said, "I didn't lose everything. I kept my word. I never flipped. That's more than most can say." By the time Anthony Corallo was processed into USP Springfield, the cameras had stopped flashing. The same people who once feared him, who whispered his name in the hallways of union offices, construction trailers, and courtroom benches, were now talking about other men, younger men, flashier names, guys who were loud on TV but wouldn't last a year behind bars. But Tony lasted. Because he never needed the spotlight to survive. He was built for shadows, and prison, at its coldest core, was just a shadow with walls. He arrived at Springfield in the dead of winter, 1987. Gray snow, hard air, chain-link fences topped with rusted wire. Not a place for punishment, not even really a prison in the traditional sense. More like a hospice for men the system wanted forgotten. Old mob bosses, aging gangsters, political rats, and ex-feds who'd fallen from grace. Tony was already 74. His joints ached, his hearing had dulled, but his mind, sharper than ever. His cell was small, always cold, always quiet. One bed, one steel toilet, a desk, and a narrow window that looked out onto nothing but a concrete wall. He didn't decorate, didn't hang photos, didn't ask for extra privileges. He brought two things with him: a tattered copy of The Prince by Machiavelli, a small Bible his mother gave him in 1929, the pages soft and thin like skin. The guards didn't treat him like a celebrity. Some didn't even know who he was. To them, he was just another old man with a limp and a nickname that sounded like something out of a bad mob movie. But a few, the older ones, knew. They whispered about the tapes, about the Jaguar, about the Teamsters and the construction contracts and the fact that New York once moved because Tony allowed it to move. And those guards, they gave him space, not out of fear, out of respect. Because even behind bars, Tony had something the others didn't: dignity. Other inmates weren't sure how to deal with him. The younger ones expected some loudmouthed boss with stories and ego. But Tony didn't talk. He didn't give speeches. He didn't tell war stories in the yard like the other old-timers. He listened. Always listened. There was a man in the unit named Bobby Dentino, a former Colombo guy. Loud, always running his mouth about back in the day and who he clipped. He thought Tony would be an ally. "You remember when we hit that guy from Jersey in '72? You must have heard about that. I was there. We dumped him in the river," and Tony cut him off mid-sentence. "If you were there, you wouldn't be talking about it." That was the end of Bobby's monologues. Tony didn't crave control in prison. There was nothing left to run. The streets were gone. The empire was buried under indictments, plea deals, and corruption charges. But he still lived with discipline. Every day he woke before lights on, made his bed, washed his face with cold water, sat and read from one of two books. Then he'd walk. Slow laps, measured steps, like a ghost keeping a routine for a world that had already ended. Other inmates eventually started to respect the routine. A few asked questions, a few asked for advice. Tony rarely answered, but when he did, it was short, sharp, and final. A young bank robber once asked him, "You ever feel like it wasn't worth it?" Tony didn't blink. "That depends. Are you still running your mouth, or have you learned yet?" The kid shut up, started making his bed every morning. He still got letters. Old associates, those who hadn't flipped or died, sent short notes. You did good. Still loyal. Wish they listened to you sooner. He read everyone, burned most of them in the laundry room trash. Some things didn't belong in the archives. One letter came from his son, Daniel. They hadn't spoken since that one visit, not face to face, but the letter was different than the first. She started walking. Calls everything Dada. I don't correct her. Sometimes I want to, but other times I think, maybe she sees something I don't. There was a photo folded inside, a little girl with a stuffed bear, smiling with a gap between her teeth. Tony stared at it for hours, didn't speak, didn't cry, just stared. Then folded it and slid it between the pages of the prints, just like the last one. In late '88, Tony had his first serious health scare. A fall in the shower, cracked rib, shortness of breath that didn't go away. Doctors said his heart was weakening. Prison medical staff told him to rest, prescribed medication, talked to him like he was already gone. Tony listened, nodded, but he never stopped walking. Never stopped waking up before the lights came on, because that was all he had left. In the evenings, he would sit near the window and listen, not to people, to the building, the hum of the radiator, the shift of concrete, the far-off rattle of metal doors closing one after another, the sound of systems still functioning. Even if the empire was gone, Tony understood systems. They were what separated men like him from the amateurs. And even now, even in a cell, he still thought like a builder. In 1989, a young black inmate named Reggie joined the unit. Quiet kid, smart, bookish, doing 5 years for armed robbery. He watched Tony from afar, eventually worked up the nerve to sit with him in the yard. "You really one of those mob bosses?" he asked one day. Tony looked at him. "Does it matter?" Reggie paused. "I guess not." Tony nodded. "Then stop asking the wrong questions." Reggie frowned. "What's the right one?" Tony waited, then said, "What did you learn from the thing that cost you everything?" Reggie never forgot that line. Years later, when he became a professor teaching criminal justice, he'd start his lectures with it. Never told his students where it came from. Some things are better kept between men who survive their own choices. By 1990, the prison was Tony's whole world. The last of his generation, men like Paul Castellano, Carmine Galante, Tommy Lucchese were all dead. Some shot, some poisoned, some rotting in prison yards like ghosts waiting to be told their stories one more time. But Tony didn't want his story told. He wanted it buried, like the others. Because in his mind, a real boss didn't live through the death of his empire. He just faded when it was done. And Tony was fading, slowly, with every step down the hallway. One day, in the fall of 1990, he collapsed during his morning walk. He didn't scream, didn't clutch his chest, didn't fall dramatically. He just sat down, slowly, and didn't get up. They brought him inside. He recovered after 2 days, refused the hospital transfer. "I'd rather go here than under a machine," he told the nurse. She nodded, didn't argue, because you don't argue with a man who's already made peace with how it ends. Tony kept walking, kept listening, kept writing nothing down. He wasn't trying to stay alive. He was just finishing the last chapter with dignity. By the time 1991 rolled around, the prison yard at USP Springfield felt like a cemetery with breathing men. Old gangsters shuffled slowly in circles, clutching their chests, talking in whispers about the past like it still had weight. Some of them died quietly in their sleep. Some were wheeled out drooling, their memories stolen by dementia and time. But Tony Duck's Corallo was different. He wasn't fading the way the others were. He was watching, remembering, and silently dismantling his legacy piece by piece, not out of regret, but out of principle. He never kept photos in his cell, no plaques, no clippings, no newspaper articles about the commission trial or his years in power. He didn't want reminders, because reminders invited nostalgia, and nostalgia was a drug for weak men. Tony didn't want to remember who he was. He wanted to preserve what he never became. There were things he could have done, lines that were always there, glowing like wires on a bomb. He'd seen others cross them. He watched men who started in suits end in orange jumpsuits with blood on their hands, their souls traded for fast money and loud deaths. He never judged them, but he never followed them either. One of those lines? Drugs. Tony had the chance. More than once. In the early 70s, an associate from Sicily offered him a pipeline, a clean route for heroin, direct to the docks, laundered through companies that had already been tested and trusted. The money was obscene. The risk was manageable. He said no. "You're turning down millions?" the Sicilian asked, confused. Tony simply replied, "I'm not turning down money. I'm turning down rot." The man didn't understand, but Tony did. Drugs made you careless. Drugs brought junkies, violence, snitches, heat, and worst of all, they brought attention. He built his empire on silence, and heroin screamed. Another line? Family. Not the Cosa Nostra kind, the real kind. There was a woman, long before the trial, Lucia, not his wife, someone from before all of it, before the suits, before the unions. She gave him a son, Daniel. Tony never married her, never visited regularly, but he sent envelopes, once a year, without fail, filled with money and silence. She never asked for more, never tried to drag him into their lives. Maybe she was smarter than most. Maybe she knew Tony had already made his decision. To protect them, he had to stay away. In Springfield, Daniel's letters came rarely, mostly short, updates, photos of his daughter, nothing too emotional, nothing asking for explanations. Tony never responded. Because what could he say? That he chose steel over skin, business over birthdays, the commission over communion? He didn't have excuses. He had reasons, but reasons don't raise children. Still, one letter stuck with him. It came in the spring of '91, written in a rushed scrawl. She asked me what her grandfather did. I didn't know what to tell her. I didn't want to lie, but I didn't want her to carry your weight either. Tony sat with that letter for an hour, then folded it carefully and slid it behind the cover of The Prince, right next to the photo. He didn't cry. He didn't curse. He just whispered, "Good. She shouldn't carry what I chose to lift." In his final years, Tony refused most visitors. A few Lucchese guys still tried. Not many were left. Some wanted to pay respect. Some wanted forgiveness. Some, in their desperation, wanted advice. He turned them all away because it was over. There was nothing left to fix, nothing left to say. The life was dead. Not because the feds killed it, not because Giuliani paraded his tapes in courtrooms. It died because the next generation didn't deserve it. They didn't understand loyalty. They didn't understand discretion. They didn't understand that power without discipline is a loaded gun in the hands of a child. He saw the headlines, of course. Gotti convicted, Gravano testifying, the mob in shambles, the old code broken. It didn't make him angry. It made him tired. He once told a nurse, half joking, "We should have gone extinct after Prohibition. At least we would have died with our boots on, not like a bunch of clowns selling our stories to publishers." She laughed. He didn't. Sometimes at night, Tony would sit by his cell window and let the cold metal of the frame seep into his bones. He'd close his eyes and try to remember the city before it rotted. Not the skyline, not the bodies, but the rhythm. The way it felt when you stepped out onto a quiet Brooklyn street at dawn, when the sidewalks were wet and the world hadn't opened its eyes yet. Back when men whispered. Back when respect was earned in silence, not traded in headlines. He never wrote a memoir, never left instructions, never confessed. Because he didn't want his story to be told. He wanted it to be felt in the empty spaces of New York that no longer existed, in the cracks of sidewalks that had been paved over by men who thought being a boss meant being seen. One night, Reggie, the young bank robber turned student, sat with him in the common area. "Ever think about telling your story?" he asked. Tony looked up, slow. "For what?" Reggie shrugged. "For history," Tony smirked. "History belongs to the men who won. I just survived." In 1992, Tony's health started to slip for good. His lungs were weak. His heart murmured like a man too tired to finish a sentence. He stopped walking, started staying in bed. The doctor said it wouldn't be long. He didn't argue, didn't ask for more time. He just asked for his books. One day, they found him sitting up in bed, the prints in one hand, the Bible on the tray beside him, eyes closed, breathing slow. He opened them when the nurse entered. "You need anything, Mr. Corallo?" He looked at her, voice hoarse. "No. Everything I need's already gone." In one of his final moments of clarity, he scribbled a single sentence on the back of an envelope. "I stayed quiet so others could live louder." I don't know if that made me a coward or a king. He folded it and tucked it inside his Bible. No name, no date, just that. Anthony Tony Dux Corallo died quietly in his sleep on August 23, 2000, inside a federal prison, miles from the city he once ruled without ever raising his voice. There was no public service, no parade, no tribute. His body was cremated, his ashes shipped to a small funeral home in Queens. Daniel never picked them up, but for a few men, old ones, long past their time, his name still meant something, not because of what he built, but because of what he refused to destroy. He could have made more, he could have killed more, he could have lived louder, but he chose to be the ghost behind the machine. And in a world that now screamed for attention, Tony Dux remained the last man who knew how to disappear. They buried him in silence, or rather, they didn't bury him at all. The ashes of Anthony Corallo sat in a cardboard box on a shelf in a Queens funeral home, labeled with a name that once carried weight in every borough of New York. But weight fades, names get dusty, and ghosts don't get headstones. But just because Tony Dux was gone doesn't mean he was forgotten. Not by the street, not by the city, and certainly not by the systems he built, which, despite the FBI's celebrations and the endless RICO convictions, kept humming quietly long after the man who built them stopped breathing. You see, Tony didn't run the Mafia like a gangster. He ran it like a technician. He built it the way an architect pours a foundation, measured, methodical, beneath everything else, meant to endure even if the buildings above it collapsed. The other bosses built empires made of names, vanity, tradition, bloodlines. Tony built systems. And systems, unlike legacies, don't die when the man does. The Garment Center in Midtown Manhattan, once a mosaic of Jewish, Irish, and Italian laborers, had long since evolved by the 2000s. The unions were cleaned up on paper. The contracts were digital now. But if you knew where to look, you could still see his fingerprints. Even 20 years after Tony's arrest, certain trucks still didn't move without the right approval. Certain buildings mysteriously failed inspections until someone made a phone call. And certain consultants still collected quiet fees for helping navigate city permits. Men with no LinkedIn, no websites, just names passed over cigars at private clubs. Tony had taught them well. He had trained a generation of men not to be loud, but to be useful. Not to be kings, but engineers of the invisible. After his death in 2000, there was a short spike in curiosity. True crime journalists, mob podcasters, half-baked documentary producers reaching out to any name even remotely tied to the Lucchese family. Most were looking for Gotti-style flash, something dramatic, bloody, outrageous. But Tony's people didn't give them that. They gave them shrugs, tight smiles, and the occasional, "Tony?" He was quiet, didn't talk much. Because even in death, his circle honored the rule. If you speak about Tony, you're already saying too much. But some of his systems weren't even in the mob anymore. That was the real trick. Tony understood early on that real power didn't come from ownership. It came from dependence. He didn't need to own the union. He just needed it to need him. He didn't need to run the contractor's office. He just needed the guy behind the desk to remember who helped his son get that job. In '78, so when the indictments came, when the arrests rolled through like a flood, Tony's structures didn't collapse. They simply shifted. From mob guys to businessmen, from soldiers to lobbyists, from capos to consultants in suits who shook hands instead of pulling triggers. It wasn't illegal. Not always. It was just understood. And that was Tony's genius. He turned criminal empire into political infrastructure. By 2005, Young developers were snapping up old union contracts in the Bronx without ever realizing that the framework they were using was built by a ghost. They filed their permits, hired their crews, bribed the same inspectors, and when things went wrong, they paid some guy named Joey to handle it. Joey didn't carry a gun. He carried a notebook. But the notebook had names, and the names had debts, and the debts still paid interest to men long dead. In Staten Island, a concrete company owner was asked in a deposition if he'd ever worked with known mob affiliates. He said no. But the records showed his father once took a loan from a man tied to Tony Ducks back in 1974. That loan had been paid off in '78, but the relationship had never ended. And when asked why his company always won certain city contracts, he simply said, "We're reliable." But in truth, he was just next in line. Another cog in Tony's invisible machine. Not all of the systems survived cleanly. Some rotted. Some were corrupted by greed and youth, used by men who didn't understand them, who thought power meant fast money and press coverage. Those ones got caught. Because Tony's systems only worked if you knew the rhythm. If you respected timing, patience, and above all, silence. You don't scream into a machine like that. You whisper. One particularly sharp federal prosecutor once told a journalist in 2007, "Corallo was the only boss who didn't act like a boss. That's what made him more dangerous. We shut him down, but we didn't kill what he built. We just put his name on a plaque and kept using his tools." She wasn't exaggerating, because even in death, Tony Ducks Corallo kept showing up. Not in mugshots, not in testimonies, but in how New York still worked behind the scenes, through old men in corner offices, union reps who never returned your first call, and business permits that took 3 tries until someone walked it through. One of Tony's old buffers, a man named Louis Sheets Trauma, had gone legit after the commission trial, opened a sanitation consulting firm, no ties to the mob, paid taxes, even taught a night class in waste management compliance. In 2011, a journalist asked him about Tony. Louis took a long drag from his cigarette and said, "Tony? He built a house without a front door. You could walk in through the walls if you knew where the cracks were. The feds knocked down the sign, but the house is still there." In Little Italy, the Mulberry Social Club had closed years ago, turned into a wine bar for tourists. But if you walked in on the right night, sat at the bar, and asked for a quiet drink, someone might point you to the back room. No mobsters, no bosses, just old men playing cards, wearing suits that hadn't fit right since the '80s, drinking espresso from chipped ceramic cups. And sometimes, if the mood was right, one of them might say, "Tony used to sit right there, never said a word, but everything ran on time." Then they'd go back to their game, as if the memory itself had to be kept short so it didn't invite ghosts. Even now in 2025, Tony Ducks is rarely named, but he's often felt. In every whispered deal, every handshake behind closed doors, every contract that falls into place after someone makes a few calls. His empire wasn't in the headlines, it was in the spaces between them. That's the difference between a mobster and a mechanic. A mobster wants glory. A mechanic wants the engine to run forever, even if no one remembers who built it. Tony was a mechanic. The streets were his circuit board. The unions were his wiring. The trucks, the cement, the city council votes, those were just switches and levers. And long after his name was forgotten by the news, the machine still ran. Because that's what ghosts do. They haunt the infrastructure. Power didn't come from titles, and Tony Corallo knew that from the start. Boss was just a word men whispered when they didn't want to admit they were afraid. Tony never used it, not for himself, not even for the men who technically outranked him when he was young. He operated by a different kind of code, not written in books or carved into the side of stone tables in dimly lit clubhouses, but etched into the spaces between decisions. It wasn't tradition, it wasn't superstition, it was strategy. A quiet, ruthless kind of strategy that kept him alive when other men got headlines and funerals. Rule 1. Don't escalate. Tony never believed in reacting fast. That was for hotheads. Guys like Carmine Galante or Joe Gallo, men who lit matches just to watch their own lives burn. When something happened, a stolen contract, a disrespectful word, a missed envelope, Tony didn't scream. He didn't retaliate that night. He waited. Because in the waiting, men revealed themselves. Some would panic, some would lie. Some would run straight into their own grave just trying to guess when the hammer was going to drop. Tony learned early that a pause was more terrifying than a punch. It wasn't about striking back. It was about watching how the man twitched before he was even touched. Rule 2. Never kill unless it changes the math. To Tony, murder was an equation, a cold calculation of cost versus benefit. If killing a man meant 10 years of federal heat, bad press, or the loss of a vital contract, he'd find another way. Embarrass the guy, strangle his income, send him into financial purgatory so he'd die slower. But if the math worked, if one dead man saved $1 million in revenue, a dozen years of peace, or preserved the illusion of control, then the hit came quietly. No flashy shooters, no street blood, just a phone call and someone didn't wake up the next morning. Tony never pulled the trigger. He didn't have to. He understood that violence without purpose is suicide dressed in bravado. Rule 3. Family is off limits, always. This was personal. There was no negotiation. Tony saw too many guys bring wives, sons, daughters into the game, flaunting power in their own living rooms, turning loyalty into generational trauma. He refused. His wife lived a life separate from his. She never asked questions. She never touched the money. Their conversations at the dinner table were about the weather, recipes, the neighbor's dog barking too late at night. She wasn't a mob wife. She was a civilian. And that's how Tony wanted it. He never told Daniel who he really was. Not directly, not face to face. That was the cost of this life. The only way to protect the boy was to not be part of the boy's life at all. Not emotionally, not physically. Just silently, in shadows and envelopes, behind layers of deniability, hoping one day the kid would understand that absence was the only form of love Tony had left to offer. Rule 4. Don't create debts you can't afford to repay. This applied to everyone, made men, street guys, even judges and councilmen. Tony didn't offer favors recklessly. If you asked for his help and he gave it, there was a price. Not always money, sometimes just a quiet obligation. And if you couldn't deliver when he came collecting, he didn't yell. He didn't chase you. He cut you off. Being cut off by Tony Corallo wasn't just a social snub. It was a death sentence by exile. No trucks, no contracts, no collections, no friends left in the game. Guys used to say, if Tony stops calling, start packing. Rule 5. Don't let them know what you want. Tony never asked for things directly. He didn't walk into a room and demand loyalty. He let men offer it. If they didn't, he moved past them. Desire, to him, was a liability. It made you predictable, manipulable. So he kept his face flat, his voice calm, his intentions vague. And that terrified people more than rage ever could. There was one story, told only in hushed tones among Lucchese old-timers, about a contractor in Staten Island who double-dipped on payments for a job Tony had approved. Tony didn't kill him, didn't have him beaten. He simply had every truck that contractor owned accidentally rerouted to the wrong construction sites. Steel beams meant for Midtown ended up in Coney Island. Cement meant for Brooklyn sat hardening in the Bronx. The guy lost 5 jobs in 1 week, filed for bankruptcy. Then one day, his accountant showed up at a coffee shop where Tony just happened to be having a quiet espresso. The accountant offered an apology and an envelope. Tony didn't take the envelope. Didn't even look up, just said, now he knows how much it costs to be greedy. Rule 6. Don't speak unless you control the echo. Tony understood that words were like bullets. Once fired, they couldn't be taken back. That's why he barely spoke in meetings. He listened, calculated, let others fill the silence with weakness. And when he finally did talk, it hit like a bomb. There was an infamous sit-down in the mid-70s with 2 rival crews fighting over Union territory. The meeting had gone on for hours. Yelling, accusations, threats of war. Tony sat quietly. Then, finally, he tapped his cigarette once on the ashtray and said, "You're both wrong. And the only reason no one's dead yet is because I've let the noise play itself out." That was it. The room went dead quiet. And both crews backed off, not because they feared bullets, but because they feared Tony's silence breaking again. Rule 7. Leave no trail, not even a legacy. Tony didn't want a statue, didn't want his name in books or on plaques. That was for politicians and movie stars. His ambition was simpler. Build something that outlives you and then disappear into it. It's why he never invested in big houses, why he never posed for pictures, why the FBI struggled to find tapes for years. Even when he got caught, it wasn't because he bragged. It was because the world got louder than his discipline. His Jaguar, the one place he trusted, was turned against him. Not by his crew, but by time. Technology. A changing world where silence no longer meant safety. Even as an old man, in prison, Tony kept to the code. A prison chaplain once asked him if he feared dying alone. Tony just shook his head and said, "You can't die alone if no one was ever close enough to begin with." Cold, maybe, but it was also true, because closeness costs clarity, and Tony never let emotion interfere with structure. But there were exceptions. Men he spared, decisions he could have made, should have made by mob logic, but didn't. One of them was a kid named Carmine Bellini, a runner who botched a payment route in the 60s and accidentally tipped off a federal probe. He should have been killed. Instead, Tony had him moved out of the city, gave him a small sanitation route in Jersey, and told him, "You've got one life, use it better than this." Bellini never spoke again, kept his nose clean, became a quiet success. He never thanked Tony directly, but every Christmas for 20 years, an anonymous envelope with a single $100 bill would show up at Tony's Forest Hills address. No note, no name, just acknowledgement. That's how Tony liked it. No noise, just balance. By the end of his life, most of the men who knew the code were dead or dying. The young blood didn't care about rules. They cared about power. That's why they fell, one by one. While Tony sat in prison with a copy of the Prince, a Bible, and no regrets, because he lived by a code no one could break unless they were willing to slow down and understand why it worked. But nobody wanted to slow down anymore. And that's why Tony was the last of his kind. By the time Anthony Corallo's ashes were quietly scattered, not in a grand cathedral, not beside the graves of legendary dons, but anonymously over a plot of dirt behind a nondescript funeral home, the world had already moved on. The name Tony Ducks had faded from headlines, outpaced by flashier, louder, more camera-hungry gangsters. The book stopped mentioning him after a few chapters. The documentaries barely gave him a segment. The street kids didn't even know the name. And that, in the end, was exactly what Tony wanted. Not to be remembered, but to be understood by only those who mattered. And most of those men were long dead. The city changed. New York, Tony's New York, was no longer a place run by silent figures in restaurant back rooms. The unions were corporate now. The streets were washed out in gentrification and social media stunts. Even the mob itself, what little was left, had been gutted into a mockery of what it once was. Guys filmed themselves, posted selfies in gold chains, flashed stacks of dirty money on Instagram. Tony would have laughed, or maybe just lit a cigarette and walked away, because for him, the moment a man wanted to be seen, he was already dead. There were no heirs, no coronation, no right-hand man who rose up to carry the code forward. Tony ended with himself, not because there wasn't someone who could have done it. He'd had capable men, but he saw where it was all going, and he chose to let the chapter close instead of faking another version of it. That was his final act of power, control over the end. In the years that followed his death, pieces of his world began surfacing in unexpected places. A judge in Jersey retired quietly after it was discovered he'd been protecting certain city contracts tied to a waste disposal firm, a firm that hadn't changed ownership since 1974. A union pension fund audit found $2.6 million unaccounted for. The trail ended at a shell company once connected to a concrete distributor Tony had controlled in the 1980s. A 20-something financial analyst working for a New York hedge fund stumbled across a real estate portfolio with unusual rental agreements, properties locked into 99-year leases that hadn't changed terms since the Carter administration. When asked about it by his boss, the analyst said, "It's like someone set this whole thing up to run long after they were gone. Like, it was meant to survive them." And it was, because Tony didn't build systems for the living. He built them for continuity, not to be owned, to endure. There's a story about a meeting that never made it into the wiretap transcripts, one that wasn't recorded, one that happened in the early 80s, just before things began unraveling. Tony met with an up-and-coming attorney, fresh out of law school, sharp, hungry, idealistic. The lawyer came recommended by a mutual contact who said, "He could be useful, but he's young. He needs direction." Tony didn't offer him a retainer. He offered him a warning. They sat across from each other in a booth, surrounded by the hum of an Italian restaurant closed to the public for the night. The young lawyer tried to impress him. Names, laws, gaps in RICO. Tony just listened. And when the kid finally stopped talking, Tony said, "You talk too much. That means you don't understand power yet." "Power isn't in the answer. It's in the silence before it." Then he stood up, left a $100 bill on the table, and walked out. The lawyer never saw him again. But 2 years later, when the indictments started rolling out, that lawyer became a behind-the-scenes advisor for a number of construction firms that Tony had once helped build. Coincidence? Maybe. But Tony had a way of placing quiet bets on men before they knew they were worth anything. There's another story, this one less known, almost whispered, about a priest in Brooklyn who once visited Tony in prison. He wasn't from the neighborhood. He wasn't even Italian. He came from upstate, said he was sent by someone who owed a favor. The guards let him through. He sat with Tony for 45 minutes. Nobody knows what they talked about. When he left, he didn't look shaken. Didn't look inspired, just changed. He later told someone in his parish, "I've heard a man confess to things without saying a word. I've seen a man carry a kingdom in his eyes and a grave in his heart. And I've seen what silence looks like when it's full." In the decades after, Tony's name popped up in lectures on organized crime. Sometimes professors at elite universities would mention him, not with awe, but with curiosity, because there was less about him to study. No memoirs, no taped interviews, no deathbed tell-alls. Just tapes recorded without his consent, transcripts leaked by the FBI, and the stories passed down by men who no longer had much to lose. And maybe that's what made him more fascinating than the Gotti-era peacocks. Tony wasn't just hard to catch, he was hard to define. He wasn't driven by vanity or violence or family revenge. He was driven by discipline, structure, the kind of structure that lets men disappear even as their hands remain on the city's pulse. And yet, for all the talk about legacy, power, and systems, Tony Corallo never once claimed to be a legend. He never spoke about the life, never ranted about loyalty, never cried about betrayal. He lived his code, and when it stopped working, he let it go. He didn't whine about the feds. He didn't cry about the rats. He didn't curse the world for changing. He simply walked off the board, piece by piece, until there was nothing left to move. In the final analysis, Tony Ducks was not a man who wanted to be loved. He wasn't even a man who needed to be respected. He just wanted to build something real in a world full of noise. Something that didn't fall apart under heat. Something that didn't scream when pressure came. And he did. He built it. He ran it. He protected it. And then, when the weight of time came knocking, he disappeared inside it. No statues, no suns, no throne, just a name in a box behind a funeral home, and a city that still runs on rules he never wrote down. If you stand on certain corners of Brooklyn at dawn, the way Tony used to, if you listen to the way the garbage trucks groan awake, If you watch the union vans pull up to job sites before the sun even knows what time it is, you'll feel it. Not loud, not obvious, but there. A rhythm, a hum, a system built by a man no longer breathing but never truly gone. Because in New York, some ghosts don't haunt buildings, they operate them.